It is so good to be here with you today. It has been a minute for me since I've been in a pulpit, since I've delivered a sermon. For me, it just feels like a homecoming coming back, not only to church, but finding this church family with you. So as I worship this morning, it's with grateful hearts to be with you. And I'm reminded of how much ritual resonates with me and how, again, I feel as though, wow, I've just kind of found the fit here as we do what we do and why we do what we do, whether it's, like we said, in word or in song or in lighting of the candles, in all of the parts of worship. The why we do what we do is so that we can connect with God and connect with each other. And I'm also just again impressed today. It reminds me, and it's good for me, not only to kind of get a feel for how our worship services go, and why we do what we do in our worship services, but that we do it together. And we do it as people of God. We do it as the children of God. And I love when Tanya gives a greeting that I hear on Sundays when I'm here sometimes. And she says, "Good morning and hello to beautiful children of God." And that we are truly in this together in all that's said and done throughout this worship time. And the song that we sang, "Open the Eyes of My Heart," is perfectly fitting. Thank you, Chris, for that song, because it fits so beautifully with the message today as we talk about the eyes of our heart being open. So I begin with this. Has anyone ever been to Emmaus? Have you had an Emmaus experience? I know there are Emmaus walks that happen. I knew somebody who went to Jerusalem and he did Emmaus walks throughout his lifetime. And I always thought it would be a really great experience. I've never been to Israel. I've never been to Jerusalem. I know Keith has, and he's experienced it. I never have. So I was curious if anyone here had been to Emmaus. And if you had been, I would say, which one have you been to? Because according to scholars, there are at least 9 possible locations that are candidates for the biblical town of Emmaus. Historians tell us there is no record of any village called Emmaus in any other ancient source, and that it was just a few hours' walk from Jerusalem. So we have a story unfolding with our text today, and we're going to see these 2 characters of our story as they walk this road to Emmaus. And in our story, these 2 characters are striding down the road to Emmaus, and we can almost hear them talking, maybe even arguing about what's happened. And we know that if this story is here, that we're a part of the story, right? And we know that if there are these 2 characters, that they're not just static in time, that we are also a part of the story that's unfolding. And as they're walking along, let's just step inside how they must be feeling, because we experience now the 3rd Sunday of Easter, that Easter has happened. We know we're people of the resurrection. We know that we're people of life and hope. But they were feeling anything but those things at this time. What they were feeling undoubtedly was, what's the opposite of hope? It's hopelessness. What they were undoubtedly feeling was despair and confusion. And we could almost hear the conversation. What on earth were they to make of all of this? And notice what Cleopas says to Jesus in verse 18. "Are you the only one here who doesn't know what's going on?" He says to Jesus. And can't you almost hear Jesus saying, I like this verse, and when I was preparing for this message, it stood out to me. Just 3 words. Oh, what things? You know, Jesus in 3 words. Isn't that like Jesus when he says something and he doesn't have to say it long? And he doesn't. Do you feel like me? Sometimes I feel like, oh my goodness, I just talk and my words are just all over the place. And is my point even getting across? And Jesus in 3 words says, oh, what things? Like, tell me more. About Jesus of Nazareth, they replied. He was a prophet. He was powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it has been 3 days since this all took place. And in addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but they couldn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels and that he was alive. And then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus. Can't you just feel all of that as they're walking and they're talking and Jesus is with them and they don't recognize them? And in those 3 short words when he says, "Oh, what things are you talking about?" And then they're like, "Well, this happened and then that happened and even the women were there and we don't know what's going on." And think about it, a time in your life when you've experienced trauma and you've had something very traumatic happen and how it must have felt for them. And you're processing it through and your mind is trying to get a hold of what the reality is, what's happening, and your heart is responding in all kinds of ways. And so for them, they're just like processing. That's the understatement of the year, right? Is to say that they're processing because they're saying these things. He was a powerful prophet. He died. We feel hopeless. We don't know where his body is at. Let's better understand their hopelessness and their confusion, because Jesus was supposed to be the Messiah. Jesus was the one who had come to liberate Israel, to free the people from oppression. Jesus was the one who was supposed to draw the people back to God, to restore the relationship between God, between God's people, and now Jesus was gone, and what had changed? Jesus was gone, and the Roman Empire was still oppressing them, still inflicting such pain and hardship, still killing them. So was it all a mistake? Was it a lie? Had they been fooled? Was this some kind of cruel hoax? Was it all a sham? Were they wrong to put their hopes in this man from Nazareth? And they had trusted Jesus. They had believed in Jesus. They had followed Jesus. Their lives really had been changed. They had been transformed, and they had seen the lives of others changed and expected even greater things, even greater changes to come. Jesus had he had confronted corrupt powers. He had charmed great crowds. Jews and Gentiles alike responded to the truth of Jesus' teaching, and they had witnessed all of these things. They saw rich and they saw poor come to Jesus, believing in his healing power. But Jesus had been shamed, he had been ridiculed, he'd been humiliated, he'd been crucified. And in addition to all of those things, now Jesus was dead. Well, was Jesus dead? Some had said they had seen Jesus alive. So it's like when something happens in our time and there's a news report and you're thinking about it. Think, for example, when 9/11 happened, 9/11 happened. I remember exactly where I was at, what I was doing when that news came across. And I remember other people processing it in their ways about, well, wait a minute, what did happen when the airplanes hit the tower? Why was that? And do you remember how that all felt at the time? And what could this possibly mean? And what could it be? And there were different reports happening at different times as you turned on the TV station. And I remember I was driving a school bus and I went to drive my kindergartner school bus route with all of this happening in the world and just feeling like, what is this breaking news that's happening? And undoubtedly how they must have felt because of all of this news, all of these events that were happening. And Jesus had survived the crucifixion by some miracle of strength. Had that happened? And they seemed so totally convinced by their own experience. Were they confused by their own grief? Were they delirious? But we know again when we look at this story that we are on a different place of this story now, because this story is literally unfolding at this time. And they loved Jesus so much. They invested so much hope in Jesus' life, in his leadership. They simply could not let him go. And then what did resurrection mean to them? Apparently, it was not the resurrection of a corpse. Jesus wasn't revived to resume his former life, to do those things he had formerly done, to take up his broken body until the day that he might die again. No, somehow this was some new mode of being that seemed to be spiritual to some, and yet so real to others. And if Jesus were risen from the dead, what would be the point of all of that? What was the point of a Messiah? To be a presumed political and religious leader if Jesus wasn't able to lead people here on earth? Where was he? They asked. How could Jesus restore Israel when he had been so easily been defeated by a handful of Roman guards? How could he change the world? And how could this world be transformed any further? How could he bring release to the captives? How could he bring justice for the poor? How could Jesus advocate for widows and for the homeless? What good could come from all of this? And we remember hearing Jesus' 3 words, "Oh, what things? Oh, what things?" And as they continue to walk, we can hear them wrestling with each other and with their own hearts on that day, on their road to Emmaus. And now, as much as we've witnessed this story, and we've witnessed these travelers on their very road to Emmaus, and again, we don't know which one. There are several roads, supposedly, historically. And have you thought about this? Maybe it's not so important that we don't know which one. And when historians say that there is really not a record of even perhaps an ancient village, and there could be 9 possible locations, well, one of the things that I think that we can get from that is that perhaps it's not so significant about which one, because that helps us see our place within this story. And that's where we step inside this story and we become travelers on our road to Emmaus as well. So the following statement might help us do that. New Testament scholars Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, we know these names, right? We love these scholars and we appreciate their work and their theology. They suggest this. They suggest that Emmaus is nowhere. Emmaus is nowhere precisely because Emmaus is everywhere. It's everywhere, that each and every one of us at one time, or indeed really all of us many times, travel our very own road to Emmaus. And you may be traveling a road to Emmaus as we speak on this very day, when you are wrestling with questions in your heart and you're grappling with something and you're processing, and there may be some news breaking in your life that feels traumatic. And if you're not, trust me, at some point we just all will, because we all really have our road to Emmaus, don't we? And we all wrestle on our very road to Emmaus. The meaning of the Emmaus Road story is that Christ journeys with us, whether we know or realize or perceive it or not. And at times, there are moments of recognition. And when we realize that these 2 characters, Cleopas and Simon, that they are really us. And that we have an invitation for transformation, just like they did. And a moment of transformation to move from hopelessness to move to celebration. So often the invitation is given in everyday life. I really believe it happens in everyday life. In the moments that are actually quite ordinary, that's where we see Jesus. Notice here that Jesus broke bread. It's a very common thing, isn't it? Eating and giving thanks. We eat every day. We have to eat for the sustenance of our bodies. And in a very common act, when he ate and he gave thanks, and through gratitude, that's very important, it was a mic drop moment for them, right? We know what a mic drop moment is. And all of a sudden, there's that aha moment, and you see something in a way that you hadn't seen it before. And you're like, how did I not see that? It is so simple, it's so clear now. And they realize it's Jesus. He had explained everything about himself. Verse 27, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all of the scriptures concerning himself. But they did not see until this mic drop moment, when the eyes of the heart were open, and it was all through a very simple act of breaking bread. And I think it's so important to notice as well that it wouldn't have happened without gratitude, right? It's with gratitude that we're changed. It's with gratitude that there's transformation. But the bread is broken. He gives thanks. The eyes of their heart are open. And this story is an invitation for all of us. It's the invitation to recognize those moments of grace. It's an invitation to say, this is Emmaus. And we are on our own very road to Emmaus. And sometimes it feels like the road to Emmaus is never ending. And it feels like I'm always on the road to Emmaus. There's always something happening, perhaps. But it's out of the routine of ordinary life that the extraordinary happens. And we might call it, again, that aha moment. You might have a lot of head knowledge, a lot of information, listened to a lot of audible books, done a lot of Bible study, faithfully attended church, practiced penitence for Lent, and said, he is risen indeed on Easter Sunday. And in all of those things, we've been taught of Jesus. And it may be that we do all of the right things. And we, at our home, we have a singing bowl, perhaps do a singing bowl or burn some sage or listen to Eckhart Tolle or practice mindfulness. Whatever it looks like in all of those ways, we can do all of the right things and we can be people of Easter. But at the same time, we don't want to lose sight of the extraordinary that is found in just the very ordinary moments, like breaking bread. So on this third Sunday of Easter, let's not forget that we will find the divine in the ordinary moments if we have eyes to see, if we have ears to hear those moments of grace. Open the eyes of our hearts, Lord. We want to see you. A few examples of Emmaus for me. So when I share some of my Emmaus moments, they're within the context of what I do as a hospice chaplain. So it's in the context of grief, it's in the context of dying, and you're like, well, that really sounds encouraging, Sam. Thank you very much for that. But a few Emmaus moments for me. And I know you have your Emmaus moments as well. The first is recently I officiated a service for one of my patients, and she was so loved. And it was an Emmaus moment when the night before I met her, I was walking into an assisted living, and I hear this really loud, noisy bird, and I said, what is that bird that I'm hearing? And there's a red cardinal just on the branch, just squawking away. And there was a nurse walking in with me. I said, wow, he's really singing us a song, isn't he? She said, yeah, do you know what it means when you see a red cardinal? I said, I do. We know that means oftentimes that a loved one is near. It means that, I've heard other versions of it, God is going to show up on the scene or the miraculous has happened. But I associate it with a moment of grace. The next morning, I go to meet my very dear patient for the very first time. And all around her house are red cardinals. And I'm talking to her family, and they said, she collects red cardinals. And she had red cardinal pot holders and teapots and paintings, and all of these things that she did with red cardinals. And I said, I just saw one last night. And I'm like, wow, look how God connects the dots. And then I was with her over the next couple of weeks, and I was with her when she died. And when she died, lo and behold, outside her window, here come a few red cardinals, literally. And I stood there and I thought, you can't make this stuff up. As they land outside the window, and there they are. And that for me was a moment of going, wow, God is here. I can see the divine in all of this that's happening. And then at her funeral, when I officiated her funeral, it was a private caregiver, stood up, and we had opened a time for everybody to share. She stood up, and everybody shared so beautifully. They shared all of these memories of their hearts, and the sharing was so beautiful. And this person who got up and was her private caregiver said this. She said, she would want you to know that she was ready, and she would want you to know that she lived her life as fulfilled and loved and embraced, and she would want you to know that she is at peace and she was ready to die. And I stood there and I watched. It was a full house, almost 200 people packed out in this funeral home, and I stood there and I watched when people get it and when there's the aha moment. Because in all of the places of the grief that had been shared, and there were laughter and there were tears, they needed to hear just that one thing. And it was an aha moment when the person stood up and said, she would want you to know this. She was ready to go because I saw what it did for them in that moment and the way that they needed it as a point of closure for their grief. And it was an aha moment. It was a road to Emmaus moment when the eyes of their hearts were open and I saw them just go, wow, I can see that. Another one that I share with you is from my husband Keith. If you don't know Keith, by the way, he's in the back. Shout out to Keith. And Keith had a road to, yes, he is here in the flesh this morning. God is good. He had a road to Emmaus moment after his dad died. He was a part of a grief group that Reverend Von Schell, Reverend Karen were leading. This is back about 2016. And in that group, he was really grappling with the things that he never could tell his father. And those things that he wished that his dad would have known. And it was just a moment in time when, I don't remember if it was Reverend Von Schell or Reverend Karen looked at him and said, your dad knows everything now. All of those things that you wish you could have told him, it is all well. It is well with his soul, and he knows fully who you are, and he knows fully all those things that you wish you could tell him. In this moment, he knows. And that was one of those, aha, wow, when the rubber meets the road and it just clicks, and it's a road to Emmaus moment, because for him it was a total game changer in his grief. The invitation is ours to see, to have eyes to see and to have ears to hear. To see and to know that in the moments that we can be changed in a moment from hopelessness to celebration of the divine. And we look for it sometimes in really big way. Easter is a huge event. It's hugely transformative, and we celebrate the risen, resurrected Christ. But we also are invited to, and that's a part of the Easter story, to recognize Christ in the divine and all that happens in those little ways when your eyes will just be open this week and you go, oh, there it is. There's that aha moment. There's the moment of grace. There it is in your daily living to see Jesus. And I close with this. I don't know how long I've shared today, if I've gone too long or not long enough. But I bring it down to this. This is where I bring it to a landing, as my daddy would say. Another patient that I had, I'm going to call him Merle for the sake of privacy. I went to visit him, and he himself was very spiritual. And he sat on the edge of his bed, and he sat up, and his eyes got really big. And he told me about his spirituality. I was very interested in hearing where he'd come from. And he told me about how he'd been a shaman and all of his spiritual path, and I'm sitting there just listening and tell me more. And he sat up on his bed, and he looked at me and he said, well, what do you think of when you hear the word, and he spelled it out, Nowhere. What do you think of when you hear that word? What is that word? Does somebody want to just call it out? Nowhere. That's exactly what I said. I said nowhere. And he said, and he was very intense, he said, look at it again. And I said, okay. And he wrote it down on a piece of paper and he held it up. And he said, now how is that spelled? And I honestly felt kind of like, okay. All right. Nowhere. Nowhere. And he said, look at it again. And I said, okay. And he said, write it down. And so I'm just like, all right, I'm engaged with you. I'm trying to be present. I'm in the moment. I'm listening. I'm validating, doing all these things a good chaplain does. So I wrote it down, Nowhere. And I said, Merle, nowhere. And he said, look at it again. And then I went, oh, now here. Now here. And I had an Emmaus moment when my eyes were open. And Jesus, all along, he's been saying, oh, what things? Like, he knows. It's just us sometimes catching up, right? So I go, now here. And he's like, thank you. And I said, yes. I said, Merle, that is it. Now here. Because the road to Emmaus means that we now have to be here. Nowhere, what does nowhere sound like? Isn't it amazing how that word can flip? Nowhere is hopelessness. Nowhere is all of the questions asked, where is Jesus at in the midst of this? What is going on? Why are we forgotten? Does any of this even mean anything? But now here moves from hopelessness to celebration. Now here is that we are people of this very moment, people of recognition of God's grace. People of seeing, wow, look at what God is doing in our world and how God is still speaking. It doesn't have to be Easter Sunday. It doesn't have to be on a spiritual retreat, as great as they are. It doesn't have to mean that you're a biblical scholar. It only needs to mean that we have eyes open to see what God is still speaking in our lives each day. Now, here. Amen.